Cairo, Egypt, July 27, 1980. In a hospital room, a man lies dying. He is thin now, frail in a way that would shock anyone who once saw him surrounded by generals and gold. Outside, the Egyptian heat presses against the walls. Inside, it is quiet. No government delegation waits in the corridor. No foreign dignitary has flown in to pay respects. The man's family stands nearby, but beyond them, almost no one. The world, it seems, has already moved on. His name is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was once the Shah of Iran, the King of Kings, the shadow of God on earth. He commanded one of the most powerful military forces in the Middle East. He sat on the peacock throne, a seat encrusted with tens of thousands of jewels. He was photographed with presidents. He was toasted by emperors. He was a man whose signature could reshape the destiny of nations. And now he is dying stateless, exiled, unwanted by the very powers he spent his life serving. He has spent the last 18 months bouncing between countries that didn't want him. Egypt took him in only out of pity. The United States, his most loyal patron for 3 decades, had quietly turned its back. Iran, the country he gave his life to, the country he genuinely believed he was dragging into the future, Iran had already erased him. His palaces were occupied. His name was being stripped from buildings, from schools, from history. The revolution that toppled him had declared him an enemy of God. Here is the question that haunts his story. Was Mohammad Reza Shah a tyrant who deserved his fall? Or was he a deeply flawed, deeply human man who tried to do something genuinely difficult and paid the ultimate price for never truly understanding the people he ruled? Because here is what most people don't know. He didn't choose this life. He didn't seize power by conquest or cunning. He was handed a throne by foreign governments at 21 years old, and then spent the next 37 years trying to be worthy of something he never asked for, while those same foreign governments quietly held the strings. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being 21. Imagine being told this country is yours, this history is yours, this burden is yours, and imagine knowing somewhere in the back of your mind that the men handing it to you could take it back whenever they chose. What would you have done with that weight? This is his story, and by the end, I think you'll find it is also, in some quiet way, a story about all of us. To understand Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, you have to understand his father, because everything about his story, the insecurities, the ambitions, the fatal blindnesses, flows directly from the shadow of Reza Shah the Great. Reza Shah was a soldier who had clawed his way to power through sheer force of will, a man born in poverty in a small village in northern Iran, a man who, through military discipline and ruthless political skill, made himself master of an ancient nation. He was iron. He was ferocious. He commanded rooms by simply entering them. His son, Mohammad Reza, was not like that, and he knew it. Mohammad Reza was born in 1919, the second child of Reza Shah's first wife. From the earliest age, he was being prepared for a throne he hadn't earned and couldn't yet comprehend. He was sent to Switzerland for his schooling, to La Rosey, the famous school for the children of European aristocracy. He learned French. He learned to ski. He fell in love with flying, something about the freedom of it, the control, or maybe the illusion of control. But he returned to a father who had little patience for softness. Reza Shah ran his household the way he ran his army: discipline, silence, deference. Mohammad Reza would later admit to close friends that his father terrified him, not with violence, but with that particular cold disappointment that cuts deeper than a blow. Whatever Mohammad Reza did, it seemed never to be enough. And yet that father handed him a country. In 1941, with World War II raging, the British and Soviet governments invaded Iran. They were concerned about Reza Shah's sympathies toward Nazi Germany. They occupied the country, split it into 2 zones, and told the old Shah one thing clearly: you must go. Reza Shah, stripped of his army and his options, abdicated. He was sent into exile, first to Mauritius, then to South Africa, where he died alone 3 years later, never seeing his country again. Mohammad Reza was 21 years old when he was called in and handed the crown. Think about what that must have felt like. His father, the most powerful figure in his life, the man he feared and admired and could never quite please, had been humiliated by foreign governments and swept away like dust. And now those same foreign governments were handing the crown to him, not because they believed in him, not because they saw greatness in this slight, nervous 21-year-old, but because they needed a compliant figure, a placeholder, someone they could manage. He was a king who came to power at the pleasure of others, and deep down, he never forgot it. In the early years of his reign, his weakness was on full display. During World War II, British soldiers walked through the streets of Tehran with the casual arrogance of an occupying force. Soviet pressure pushed at Iran's northern borders. His own government ministers treated him like a ceremonial figure, someone to sign papers and pose for photographs, nothing more. One British ambassador, in a private memo from the 1940s, described him as anxious and malleable, useful. The young Shah tried to assert himself. He pushed for reforms. He tried to build relationships with the military. He got married first to Princess Fawzia of Egypt, a match arranged for political reasons that produced one daughter and nothing else. She left. He remarried. He searched for an heir and found none for years, a gap that fed both his personal anxiety and the political vultures circling his throne. Iran in these years was not at peace with itself. The country was extraordinary, ancient, layered, dignified. Persian civilization was thousands of years old. The people had their own deep culture, their own poetry, their own fierce sense of identity. But the country was also desperately poor. Oil wealth flowed from Iranian soil and into British pockets through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Iranian workers drilled the wells, and British shareholders cashed the dividends. A simmering fury was building, and into that fury stepped a man who would become the Shah's greatest crisis, and perhaps the making of everything that followed. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and what happened between these two men changed Iran and Mohammad Reza Shah permanently. By 1951, Mossadegh had become something dangerous to the powerful. He was popular. He was elected prime minister by the Iranian parliament on a single, blazing promise: nationalize the oil. Take it back. What lies beneath Iranian soil belongs to the Iranian people. The crowds adored him. He was theatrical, emotional. He would weep in parliament. He would faint at strategic moments. He was also, beneath all that theater, a brilliant legal mind and an implacable negotiator. When Britain refused to accept nationalization, he refused to back down. When they imposed a blockade on Iranian oil, he still refused. The Shah, meanwhile, was caught in the middle. He was not an opponent of oil nationalization. In principle, he agreed with it. But Mossadegh was beginning to cut away the Shah's power. The prime minister was reducing the monarchy to a rubber stamp. And the Shah, still haunted by what happened to his father, still fundamentally unsure of himself, was paralyzed. The British, furious at losing their oil profits, went to the Americans. This was 1953, and America was terrified of communism. If Iran collapsed into chaos, they argued, the Soviets would move in. Mossadegh had to go. And so, in August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence ran Operation Ajax, a covert operation to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. They bribed military officers. They hired crowds to riot. They manipulated newspapers. They manufactured a crisis. And in the chaos that followed, Mossadegh was arrested, convicted of treason, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, dying in 1967 without ever being truly free again. And the Shah was flown back from Rome, where he had briefly fled in a panic, terrified the coup might fail. He returned to a country that had just watched its democracy dismantled by foreign hands, with him as the beneficiary. This is the moment that poisoned everything. Not because the Shah ordered the coup, the evidence suggests he was more passenger than driver, but because he accepted it, because he came back, sat on the throne, and ruled as though 1953 had not happened. For millions of Iranians, it had very much happened. They had seen their elected leader removed by foreign governments, and now the man those governments preferred, the Shah, was in charge. Whatever goodwill Mohammad Reza might have built was cracked, and the crack would deepen with every passing year. What would you have done in his position? Refuse the throne, go back into exile, challenge the Americans and British who had just proven they could topple governments? It is easy from our vantage point to say what the right thing would have been. It is harder to imagine being that man, insecure, dependent, aware that without foreign support you might last as long as your father did, and choosing to stay. The Shah, stung and strengthened by the coup in equal measure, now set about doing something that he genuinely, deeply believed in: modernizing Iran. In 1963, he launched what he called the White Revolution, a program of sweeping reforms that would, he believed, transform Iran into a modern industrial nation. Land was redistributed from wealthy landowners to the peasants who actually worked it. Women were given the right to vote and to run for public office. A literacy corps was created to send educated young people into rural villages to teach people to read. New infrastructure, new hospitals, new universities. By many measurable standards, it worked. Between 1963 and 1977, Iran's GDP grew at one of the fastest rates in the world. Tehran became a modern city, with cinemas and universities and a burgeoning middle class. Iranian women were in the workforce, in the professions, in the universities. Life expectancy rose. Child mortality fell. The Iran of 1977 looked nothing like the Iran of 1953. The Shah genuinely believed, that he was giving his people a better life. He would point to the statistics. He would point to the new factories, the new schools, the rising income levels. He was impatient with those who didn't see it, and that impatience was his undoing. Because modernization, done from the top down at speed, without consent, creates its own violence. It displaces people. It disrupts traditions. It tells a deeply religious, deeply rooted culture. What you have believed and practiced for 1,000 years is embarrassing and backward, and we are replacing it. The clergy, the mullahs who served as the moral and spiritual anchors of Iranian communities, were outraged. And leading the outrage from the moment of the White Revolution onwards was a man the Shah had exiled as an irritant in 1964, a man he would later dismiss as a dangerous medieval relic. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. The Shah made Savak, his secret police, into a feared and brutal instrument of suppression. Critics disappeared. Dissidents were tortured. The gap between the Shah's self-image as a benevolent modernizer and the reality experienced by those who dissented from his vision was enormous. He genuinely didn't see the contradiction. Or perhaps, more tragically, he saw it and believed progress required it. And underneath all of it was a loneliness that his closest aides would describe with something like pity. The Shah had no real confidants. He surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. His third wife, Faradiba, a remarkable woman, genuinely beloved, tried to give him honest counsel. But the structure of power he'd built isolated him from truth. His generals told him the army was loyal. His intelligence chiefs told him the population was grateful. And he, who had grown up in a palace, who had spent his adult life in the echo chamber of absolute power, believed them. In 1977, something changed in the air. The Shah couldn't feel it, or didn't want to. Oil wealth had created its own problems. The sudden flood of money had overheated the economy. Inflation was raging. Thousands of young Iranians had gone abroad for education, had absorbed ideas about democracy and self-determination, and had returned home to find a country where none of those things were permitted. The gap between the Shah's Iran and what Iranians wanted their Iran to be was no longer a rumble. It was a roar. The protests began in 1977, small and scattered. By 1978, they were everywhere. Workers, students, merchants from the bazaar, the deeply religious, the committed leftists, people who had nothing else in common except that they had had enough. They poured into the streets in numbers that even Savak could not suppress, and Savak, that feared instrument of control, began to melt away. And here is the cruelest detail of all. The Shah was sick. In 1974, he had been quietly diagnosed with a form of lymphoma. He had kept it secret, even from most of his inner circle. The French doctors treating him told him little about the severity of his condition, either out of professional caution or political calculation. He was taking medications that affected his clarity of thought, his energy, his ability to make decisions. The man who needed to respond decisively to the greatest crisis of his reign was, for much of 1978 and 1979, a man dealing with a cancer diagnosis he barely understood, a medication regime that clouded his judgment, and an intelligence apparatus that kept feeding him comfortable lies. He tried to find a middle path. He made concessions. He promised elections. He dismissed his hardline ministers and brought in moderates. He gave speeches about liberalization. But it was too late, and even if it hadn't been too late, no concession short of his abdication would have satisfied the momentum that had gathered against him. In the first days of January 1979, he made his final decision. He would leave. Temporarily, he told people, for a rest, for medical treatment. He would return when things calmed down. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah walked out of Mehrabad Airport in Tehran, carrying a small container of Iranian soil. He wept. The soldiers and officials who had come to see him off wept too. Some of them, the ones who understood, knew what this departure really was. He would never come back. Iran would never have him back. The rest of the world would make sure of that too, in a way that perhaps hurt most of all. What followed his departure is one of the most striking stories of abandonment in modern political history. The Shah left Iran and flew to Egypt, where Anwar Sadat received him warmly, one of the very few leaders who would. From Egypt he went to Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico, then finally he came to the United States, but only for a specific, painful reason. His cancer had progressed. He needed surgery. The Carter administration, which had been doing complex diplomatic calculations about whether admitting the Shah would inflame the new Iranian government, finally agreed to let him in on humanitarian grounds. The date was October 22, 1979. He was admitted to the Cornell Medical Center in New York. 12 days later, on November 4, 1979, Iranian student militants stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. Their central demand: return the Shah to Iran to face trial. The United States suddenly had a very different problem. The man who had been their loyal ally for decades, who had kept oil flowing and Soviet influence at bay, who had bought billions of dollars of American weapons and hosted American intelligence bases. That man was now a political liability so toxic that the most powerful country in the world needed him to disappear. He was pressured to leave the United States. He went to Panama. Panama was pressured too. He went back to Egypt, the only country that had never wavered because Anwar Sadat, a man who understood loyalty in ways the superpowers had forgotten, kept the door open. Think about what those months must have been like. This man had spent 37 years as one of America's most important allies. He had done things he should not have done, tolerated things he should not have tolerated, in part because American support required it. And now, in his final year of life, dying of cancer, no longer useful to anyone, the Americans were quietly asking him to please go away and stop causing problems. What does that do to a man? What does it do to your understanding of everything you gave your life to, all the compromises, all the cost, when you discover that it was transactional all along? On July 27, 1980, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi died in Cairo. He was 60 years old. Anwar Sadat gave him a state funeral. The grave was modest. He was buried in the Al-Rifai Mosque, the same mosque where his father-in-law, Egypt's last king, had been laid to rest years before. A cemetery of exiles. Iran didn't mourn. The new government celebrated. And yet here is what history has been doing ever since. Quietly, slowly, stubbornly, the story has been getting more complicated. Many of the Iranians who cheered the revolution in 1979 did not get what they marched for. They marched for freedom, for democracy, for dignity. They got a theocracy. The generation that came of age after the revolution, the generation that has grown up with the Islamic Republic, has been searching, sometimes desperately, for different stories about who they are and where they came from. And many of them, to the discomfort of the regime that deposed him, have been finding their way back to the Shah. Not in an uncritical way. Not pretending Savak didn't exist. Not pretending the repression wasn't real. But in the way that people find their way back to complicated figures when the alternative, the thing that replaced them, turns out to be worse in certain ways they hadn't imagined. There is nostalgia in Iran for the era of the Shah, particularly among older Iranians, that the current government has found both baffling and threatening. They have had to ban certain music, certain films, certain images, because Iranians keep returning to them. That is not simple nostalgia for a golden age. It is something more honest, a recognition that history is rarely a clean story of villains and heroes, that human beings, including the ones in power, are usually doing complicated things for complicated reasons, and that judgment from outside and after is always easier than decision from inside and before. Mohammad Reza Shah was a man who came to power too young, under foreign pressure, in a country he loved but never quite understood, or perhaps understood only from too great a height. He wanted to modernize Iran. He succeeded by many measures. He also silenced and tortured people who disagreed with him. He allowed himself to be corrupted by the absolute certainty that he knew what was best. He trusted foreign allies who, in the end, were incapable of loyalty. And he never, not until the very end, developed the ability to truly listen to his own people. Was he a tyrant? By some definitions, yes. Was he also a man genuinely trying to build something? Also, yes. Was he the product of forces beyond his control, foreign interference, Cold War calculations, the particular loneliness of absolute power? Undeniably, yes. These things can all be true at once. That is what makes his story human. And here is what I find myself returning to, thinking about his story. The container of Iranian soil he carried with him when he left. That small gesture. You can construct whatever argument you like about his rule, and historians will keep doing that for generations. But a man who carries soil from his country as he boards his final flight is not entirely a man who didn't love it. What does it mean to love something and still fail it? What does it mean to be given enormous power and never quite grow into it? What does it mean to spend your life building something, genuinely building it, with real schools and hospitals and roads, and still have it rejected? These are not just questions about a Shah. These are questions about ambition and legacy and what we owe each other, about the difference between doing good for people and doing good with people, about how power, when it cuts itself off from honesty, eventually hollows out everything it was supposed to protect. His story doesn't offer easy lessons, but it offers real ones. We began with a hospital room in Cairo, a dying man, a country that had already written him out of its story, a world that had moved on. But here we are decades later still talking about him, still debating him, still finding in his story echoes of things we recognize, the weight of inherited obligation, the loneliness of power, the cost of never truly listening, and the particular heartbreak of loving something you couldn't hold. Whatever you think of Mohammad Reza Shah, and reasonable people think very different things, his life poses a question that doesn't go away. Is it possible to do genuine good with compromised hands? Is it possible to build real things on a flawed foundation? And when the things you've built are swept away, does the effort still matter? I don't know the answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I think asking the question honestly about him and quietly about ourselves is worth something. The Iranian people are still asking it. Every generation that comes after 1979 has to reckon with what was lost, what was gained, and what might have been different if different choices had been made by him, by the revolutionaries, by the foreign governments that manipulated them all. History doesn't give us clean endings. It gives us inheritances, complicated, contested, never entirely resolved. And perhaps that is the most human thing about it. Before you go, I have a question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. In your own life, have you ever been given a responsibility you didn't ask for, a role, an obligation, a situation you inherited rather than chose? And if so, how did you carry it? Because I think that, more than oil or politics or Cold War strategy, is what Mohammad Reza Shah's story is really about. The weight of what we inherit, and what we choose to do with it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read and reply to every single one. And if you're watching this from Iran or from somewhere in the Iranian diaspora, I especially want to hear from you. This story is yours in a way it isn't mine, and your perspective matters. Where are you watching from today? Tell me below. If this story moved you, or challenged you, or simply made you think, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't, and turn on the bell because we release a new story every week, and next time it's going to be just as good as this one. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one. Owl.